Hi writers, and welcome to this short video for our Introductory to Creative Writing class where I introduce the genre of poetry. So all semester we've been working on a lot of the building blocks of any kind of good writing, particularly creative writing: images, sound, point of view, figures of speech, and more. And so now what we want to do is think about how we can apply those skills, those tools to different genres. And we're beginning with poetry. And you did a little bit of reading prior to this and thought about some of the things, the preconceptions you had about what makes a poem. And a lot of times, and we talked about this at the beginning of the semester, a lot of times we'll come in thinking what a poem has to do, right? A poem has to rhyme, or a poem has to look like a poem, all these things. And I actually like to employ some different language than thinking about what poetry has to do, and rather think about what poetry gets to do, right? So that there's actually all this freedom and opportunity for play that poor prose writers, not all of them, but genres like fiction may not have quite as much freedom to play with. Now, those divisions aren't super solid, and lots of us enjoy playing with them a little bit, doing cross-genre, multi-genre, or even trying to pioneer new genres. And I want to say that and acknowledge that while also talking about some of the characteristics and traits of most poems. So I'm borrowing a little bit from the ideas of a book called Why Poetry by the poet Matthew Zapruder. And he's borrowing from other people's ideas, but I really like the clarity and synthesis that he presents in terms of thinking about what differentiates many poems, a lot of poetry, from a lot of prose. So, and again, this is not 100% true all the time, but it can help us think about those things that poetry gets to do. So he talks in his book, Why Poetry, which I have here, talks about the three engines of poetry: form, music, and association. So I'm going to start with form, which in particular is something that poets get to play with in a more conscious, more sustained way than some kinds of prose. Again, I'm hedging this a little bit because you can, of course, have fragmented prose that's playing with the page and space in some similar ways. But for the most part, this is going to hold true. So when we think about form, it's not just forms like sonnets, villanelles, pantoums, guzzles, whatever it is, although those are forms. Those are received forms. But when we talk about form, we also just mean the choices that we make on the page. That can be line length, short or long. It can be line breaks. Do we enjam? Do we have end stops? How often do we end stop? Are we using stanzas? What kinds of stanzas? How do different stanza choices affect the movement of a poem? We've talked about a little bit about this going through the semester, but now we're going to be a little bit more concentrated in our discussion of it. These are amazing choices that a poet gets to make, right? So when we enjam a line, the way we can emphasize a word both on the end of the line and the word on the beginning of the next line, and also how we can create surprise, how we build anticipation, subvert or realize that expectation, create multiple meanings, which have multiple, can create nuance and more possibilities within a poem. So these are all really exciting things that when you are typing in a paragraph, you don't always get to play with. So, and part of that also is patterns, right? The patterns. Is there repetition? That's part of form. Are we returning to words, lines, sounds? And I want to read, oh man, which poem is the one I wanted to read for this? So I'm going to read a poem by Viby Francis from her award-winning book, Forest Primeval. It's one of my favorite books. And it's and you'll have access to this. I'll give you copies of this. So it's called A Song on the Ridge, but I do want just to, and it might be backwards, I forget how the filming, I'm old, it's film, how it works, right? So if it's backwards, but you can still see that there are, we have extra space in between lines. We have this white space in between these columns, and then we have a kind of almost a drizzling down of language at the end. So I'm going to read it. Poems, this positioning of work means that you can do multiple reads. So we could read all the way down this column, then all the way down this one. I'm going to read it across, left to right. A Song on the Ridge. I was a spinner and a speller, a seller and a deceiver. Back on the ridge was a thief and the theft, a weaver and the weft. Back on the ridge, a tiller and a teller, a sipper and a slipper. Back on the ridge, I was the secret and the spill, a spider and the wound. Back on the ridge, I was a seer and a swiller, a quail and a hound. Back on the ridge, I heard the music and I sang it, a symphony of bark. Back on the ridge, I threw cards and the bones upon a potter's wheel. Back on the ridge, I sought shadows and the shade. I was not afraid. Back on the ridge, I was the fiddle and the picker, a wife and a sinner. Back on the ridge, I was lightning over water, the cross and a believer. Back on the ridge, back on the ridge, back on the ridge, back on the ridge, back on the ridge. So I think we see, and we can do that discussion of how the poem creates meaning in a different way later, but I think we can see how the use of space, right, the creation of pauses, the creation of emphasis with this repetition, putting the definitions of self and the location of place. We see the location of place given almost equal weight to the definitions of self. So the role of place in the creation of self, the understanding of self, and how it's the place that we come back to, not that we're in, but back on the ridge, going back in time, almost as this place we can't shake, that is difficult to move past. It's not now in the present, now in the city, it's back on the ridge, back on the ridge. And that is achievable through form. You can write a prose version of that, and perhaps a prose version that starts off, when I was a child on the ridge, I often, and then it goes through a story. That can have its own power, of course. But the power achieved in this piece is through music, and it's through form and association. But let's use that as an opportunity to then go into talking about music. So when we talk about music, and we had our whole unit on sound, we are talking about the sound work. We're talking about rhyme, half rhyme, full rhyme, rhyme play, rhyme schemes. We're talking about repetition. We're talking about alliteration, consonants, all of those different things. And again, prose writers absolutely get to play with this, but poets get to play with it more. What can read as distracting, repetitive, or sort of attention-seeking in prose can be subtle and recalling and beautiful in poetry. So again, those things that we get to do. So I'm going to read, let's see which one I'm going to read. All right, this is a poem by Jacques Rancourt in his book Novena. It's one of the Lena Miles Weaver Todd Prize for Poetry, published by our very own Pleiades Press here at the University of Central Missouri. Woo woo. Go Mules / Jennies. This is a poem called Active Contrition. You'll see it's in stanzas, it's in couplets, so that's stanzas of 2 lines, right? And of course, we've talked about how that affects the pacing and the movement of the poem. Those stanza choices are incredibly important. They also link ideas together. So again, you'll be able to read this when in the posted work. Active contrition. 2 people who are honest for the first time speak honestly to each other. There are flocks of sheep, herding dogs inside me. There are lovers I've paired from apples with knives. This season of smut split up into 2 until the body could have what the body was not allowed. In winter, I became one part driven to fleas and mange, teeth, the other part left foaming over. The sky then pink as the underside of my tongue, pink as the skin beneath the dead fox's fur. Lover, I firmly resolved to amend my life, but I keep breaking it. So there's some wonderful sound play in here. And one of the things that I like that Matthew Zapruder points out in his book, Why Poetry, is that when we as writers are not committed to a story structure, when we're not committed to saying a whole thing, when we're not committed to all these different things that perhaps some fiction is committed to, we have the chance to follow language. We have the chance to follow music, to say, ooh, that sound makes me think of this sound, so now my poem's going to go over there. We may not always have that freedom in some kinds of prose because we're like, well, no, I have this storyline, I have this agenda, I need to get over here. And the poem says, oh, whoa, I got distracted by this pretty shiny thing, and now I'm going to wander over here, which makes poets sound kind of like space cadetty. But I'm not going to say that we're not. But anyway, back to the poem. So there are lines like this repetition of honest. There are two people who are honest for the first time speak honestly to each other. And then we get a colon. There are flocks of sheep herding dogs inside me. There are lovers I've paired, P-A-R-E-D, from apples with knives. So in a poem about two people speaking honestly to each other, and the word lovers, and we get paired, we expect P-A-I-R-E-D, right? Lovers paired. And then it's yet paired, like you're pairing an apple paired from apples with knives. This season of smut, split up into two. And again, the pairing, even though it's never used the word pair, P-A-I-R, it's using sound to create these associations in our brain, right? Where these connotations, we're like, so that we know which pair, but we're also kind of bringing all the other pairs into here, and it's playing with that. Split up into two until the body could have what the body was not allowed. This wonderful repetition of words really close to each other is kind of risky because I think in some kinds of writing we'd be tempted to say, well, now I need a thesaurus, I need a different word besides body. But this says no, right? That it's so sparse and there's so few words in the poem that it makes that repetition very intentional. Okay, that's a beautiful poem. So we talked about form, we talked about music, and we'll talk about all of this still some more. Music is sort of the music of the line too, the syntax, that sentence structure, that we're not tied to grammatical structures always. It still has to make sense. But we're not tied to those structures in the same way that pieces of prose generally, again, generally, not all of them, but generally have to attend to. So we get to break things, we get to use fragments. We can have one-word sentences. You can have no sentences in a poem. My God, you can have no punctuation in a poem. If you do use punctuation, it has to be employed with some logic, some interior logic, and if you have no punctuation, it still needs to have some logic. So you're not, it's not a free-for-all, except it is a free-for-all. But if you want the poem to mean something beyond your own experience writing it, then we need to have some sort of interior logic. Anyway, lastly, we're going to talk about association. Association, again, is this move engenders this move, and then this makes me think of this and makes me think of this, because we're not trying to tell a story. And I think that even if you sit down to write a narrative poem, which starts with a story, we need to feel very comfortable breaking free of that story. If the writing is pulling us in a different direction, go in that direction. You don't need to finish the story. Writers begin a poem with a story all the time, and then the poem just goes somewhere else, and that's absolutely okay. Am I going to show you an example of that? I don't know. I forgot what my next example is. Let's look at... Oh, I know what I'm going to read to you. It's on my computer, so I'm going to stare in a weird area. So this is by the poet Mary Ruefle, who might be a goddess. It is hard to say. It's called Super Bowl. So this is about association and moves outside the original narrative. So pay attention to that. Super Bowl. Who won? I said. The game's tomorrow, he said. And I became the snail I always was, crossing the field in my helmet. But I'd given it my all, while the plane arced on its way to a landing, when I overheard the woman behind us say, I was gathering wildflowers to make a wreath to lay on my mother's grave when my son fell off a mountain in Italy. And I felt such joy over the unknown outcome of her words, I was not ashamed, for I can feign interest in the world, just as she in that great green meadow must have. I like using this poem as an example for association because even though it moves and travels so wildly, so we begin with an implied domestic setting, right? A woman and a man. She's like, oh, what time's that football game? He's like, or she said, who won the football game? He's like, it's not until tomorrow. And we get this sort of stereotypical heteronormative relationship, right? She's like, you like football, and he's like, women. But it moves out of that super quickly because there's this idea of, then she imagines herself as a snail, like slowly trying to move through to understand. But I'd given it my all, she says, and then it moves to the plane above, right? There's like this plane, and then one time she was on a plane, she overheard a conversation of a woman saying something to someone else. She said, I was gathering wildflowers to put on my mother's grave while my son fell off a cliff in Italy. So then we go from the grave to Italy and then back into the speaker who says, and I felt such joy at the over the unexpected outcome of her words. I was not ashamed, for I can feign interest in the world, just as she in that great green meadow must have. And so we have this poem that's about this attempt to be connected, right? To be connected to the world and how the world often keeps denying our attempts. And I don't know Mary Ruvel's process, so we're not here to talk about authorial intent or exactly how she enacted this association, but the poem's associative moves are clear, right? We're talking about football, and then it makes me think of this thing, and then it's this thing, and it reminds me of this, which helped me realize this, and now I see this is who I am. And so the poem does all these things in a really short amount of time because it lets itself abandon the initial narrative, that triggering town. It says, okay, that's how I got in, but that's not how I'm getting out. And that's a wonderful possibility about a poem. How you get in has nothing really necessarily, it can come back, it can bookend, but it doesn't have to, right? It has all these possibilities. So we will continue talking about this more, but this quick introduction to the genre of poetry, we've talked about a lot about the different tools of a poem, but I want us to think about why would I sometimes write a poem and why would I sometimes write a story and why would I sometimes write an essay? I don't think you need to make these huge allegiance, and I don't think you should declare for house poetry over house prose. You can serve two masters. Actually, don't serve any masters. Let's just all work together. I'm not great at metaphors for a professional poet, but I think you get my drift. Okay, I can't wait to hear your thoughts about this, and happy reading. Bye.